Narrative note. This story is told through the voice of a fictional, composite Allied airman. The narrator is not meant to represent a specific historical person. The events, people, aircraft, dates, and major outcomes are based on the documented history of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. I was 24 years old in March of 1943, but the war had already made most of us feel older. In New Guinea, a man learned to measure his life in engines, weather reports, fuel gauges, and the empty bunks of friends who had failed to return. We did not speak much about the future. The future was the next mission, the next sunrise, the next time the operations officer pointed at a map and told us where the enemy would be. Even now, after all these years, there are mornings when I wake with the sound of those engines in my head. I remember the heat pressing against the metal skin of the aircraft. I remember the smell of oil, sweat, cordite, and damp canvas. Most of all, I remember the sea on the morning of March 3, 1943. It was bright, almost beautiful, and covered with ships carrying thousands of men toward a battle many of them would never reach. People later described the Battle of the Bismarck Sea with arrows on maps and ships in neat columns, 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, a Japanese reinforcement movement broken. Those facts are true, but a map cannot show what it felt like to fly at mast height toward a warship firing back. The airfields from which we operated were hardly the polished bases people imagine when they see wartime photographs. Port Moresby was dust when the weather was dry and mud when the rains came. Tents sagged under tropical storms, tools rusted, clothing never seemed completely dry. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion took men out of action as surely as enemy fire. Engines had to be kept alive in heat, grit, and salt air by mechanics who often worked without enough sleep or spare parts. We trusted those men with our lives before we ever left the ground. New Guinea also taught us how small an aircraft could be against the country beneath it. The Owen Stanley Range rose like a wall, with cloud packed into the valleys and jungle covering slopes. Where a forced landing offered little hope, pilots could survive an enemy attack and still be lost to weather on the journey home. That knowledge followed us into every briefing. We were not only flying toward Japanese guns, we were flying through a landscape that punished error without caring which uniform a man wore. Perhaps that is why the sea remains so clear in my memory. It looked open and uncomplicated compared with the mountains. On March 3, however, the open water became the most crowded and violent place any of us had ever seen. To understand how we came to that morning, you have to begin with a man named Paul Gunn. Everybody called him Pappy. He was 43 then, which seemed ancient to young pilots like us. He was not an old man, of course, but he had the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life around engines and open cockpits. He had served 20 years in the United States Navy, learned to fly, learned to repair what he flew, and later made a life in the Philippines. Before the war, he helped operate commercial air services there. He knew aircraft not as elegant machines described in manuals, but as working tools that could be cut, strengthened, rewired, and forced to do jobs their designers had never imagined. The war made his work personal. When Japanese forces closed on the Philippines, Gunn was ordered out on a flight carrying military personnel. His wife, Polly, and their 4 children remained behind. In January 1942, they were interned at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila with thousands of other Allied civilians. Gunn knew they were prisoners. He knew food was becoming scarce. He also knew he could not simply fly back and bring them out. I never heard Pappy make speeches about revenge. Men like him seldom explained themselves that way. He worked. He worked. That was how he answered fear and helplessness. He worked on aircraft until the light failed, and then he found another lamp. He listened to pilots describe what had gone wrong over a target. Then he changed the machine and sent them back to try again. We knew only fragments of Gunn's private burden at the time. War does not always reveal a man's whole life to those working beside him. A name might be mentioned, a letter folded into a pocket, or a photograph placed near a toolbox. Years later, the outline became clearer. Polly and the children were not simply waiting in an occupied city. They were living behind wire at Santo Tomas, where shortages worsened as the war continued. Their survival depended on food, disease, the decisions of guards, and the uncertain progress of armies thousands of miles away. It would be easy to place every modification Gunn made inside a story of personal vengeance. The truth is more disciplined. He was a professional airman solving an operational problem for the 5th Air Force. His family's captivity gave the war an intimacy few of us could fully understand. But the machines he altered were not private weapons. They belonged to squadrons, were flown by crews, serviced by teams, and used within plans approved by commanders. Gunn's importance came from his ability to join urgency with practical knowledge. He did not need to invent a dramatic explanation for his effort. Each aircraft that returned with its crew alive was an argument. Each ship damaged at low level was evidence. In wartime workshops, proof was measured in what could fly tomorrow. It is often said that Gunn alone invented the B-25 Strafer in a shed without orders. That makes a dramatic story, but history is rarely the work of one man acting alone. Gunn had already experimented with adding forward-firing weapons to attack aircraft, and he possessed the practical skill to make such ideas real. But Lieutenant General George Kenney, commander of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, recognized the need and gave the work official support. Kenney wanted aircraft that could stop Japanese shipping at low altitude. He directed Gunn and the men around him to turn B-25 Mitchell bombers into something more aggressive. The standard B-25 had been designed as a medium bomber. In many versions, a bombardier occupied a glazed nose and aimed bombs from altitude. That arrangement made sense against a fixed target. It made less sense against a ship that could turn while the bombs were falling. Kenney and Gunn wanted a machine that could come in low, strike hard, and survive the final approach. At Eagle Farm near Brisbane, Gunn worked with mechanics and a North American aviation representative named Jack Fox. The glazed nose was replaced with a solid one. Heavy, 50 caliber machine guns were installed to fire straight ahead. More guns were mounted along the sides of the fuselage. By the time the modified B-25C-1 aircraft went into battle, each could bring 8 forward-firing .50 caliber guns onto a target. That number matters, but it does not explain the effect. A single .50 caliber machine gun was a serious weapon. 8 firing together could rake a ship from bow to stern in seconds. The guns could smash exposed positions, tear through light structures, damage the bridge, and force anti-aircraft crews to take cover. Their purpose was not only to kill, their purpose was to suppress. A pilot approaching low over the water needed a few seconds in which the enemy gunners could not aim properly. The forward guns were meant to purchase those seconds. Inside the B-25, no man fought alone. The pilot aimed the forward guns, but armorers loaded them, mechanics kept the engines turning, and the rest of the crew watched instruments, navigation, radio traffic, and the sky behind. At low altitude, one missed warning or one damaged control could kill everyone aboard without warning. The modifications were not simple. Guns and ammunition added weight, recoil, stressed the airframe, and the aircraft still had to remain controllable near the water. Gun and the ground crews tested, adjusted, and repaired under wartime pressure because the old methods were not producing enough results. High and medium altitude bombing against moving ships had achieved some successes, but accuracy was uncertain. A ship that saw the attack could maneuver. Bombs released from thousands of feet took time to fall, and even a near miss might do little more than throw up a column of water. Torpedo attacks could be effective, but they required specialized aircraft, reliable weapons, favorable conditions, and a dangerous approach. In New Guinea, weather, maintenance problems, distance, and enemy fire complicated every method. The answer was not a single miracle weapon. It was a combination of intelligence, training, different aircraft types, coordinated timing, strafing, and low-level bombing. That is important because the victory at the Bismarck Sea did not belong to one pilot, one squadron, or one nation. Americans and Australians prepared it together, and many kinds of aircraft played a part. One of the most important techniques was low-level bombing, commonly called skip bombing. The basic principle was simple to describe and difficult to perform. The aircraft approached very low, released a bomb ahead of the ship, and allowed it to strike the water at a shallow angle. Under the right conditions, the bomb skipped forward and hit the vessel near the waterline, or passed into its side before a delayed fuse detonated. Major William Benn was central to the development and testing of low-level anti-shipping methods in the Southwest Pacific. He did not live to see the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. He disappeared during an operational flight in January 1943. By March, the technique he had helped advance was being practiced by men who understood that they would have only one chance to judge height, speed, distance, and release point while a ship was firing at them. We trained against the wreck of the Pruth near Port Moresby. The old vessel lay stranded and rusting, a convenient target that did not shoot back. We approached again and again. At low altitude, the world moved differently. Water rushed beneath the nose. A small wave seemed large. The target filled the windshield faster than instinct said it should. Release too early, and the bomb would fall short. Release too late, and you might strike the mast, the hull, or the sea itself before you could climb. There were stories afterward that we had trained until we could not miss. That was never literally true. Men miss in war, guns jam, and smoke hides targets. Still, practice made us far more accurate. We learned when to hold steady, when to break away, and how to trust the rebuilt aircraft. Among the pilots preparing for the attack was Major Edwin Ed Lana, commander of the 90th Bombardment Squadron, of the 3rd Attack Group. Lana was only 25. He had a reputation for extraordinary skill and for flying with a boldness that sometimes worried those around him. In combat, that confidence could carry a formation through the moment when caution told every man to turn away. It could also become dangerous. No one knew then how little time he had left. By early 1943, the Japanese position in New Guinea had become increasingly difficult. Their forces at Lai and Salamaua needed men, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, and equipment. The sea route remained essential. Aircraft could carry only a fraction of what an army required. Barges and submarines could move supplies in smaller quantities, but a major reinforcement demanded transports and escorts. The Japanese operation was known as Operation 81. The convoy assembled at Rabaul and carried roughly 6,900 troops, most connected with the Japanese 51st Division, along with supplies needed at Leb. 8 transport and cargo vessels were escorted by 8 destroyers under Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. Senior Army officers traveled with the force, including Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi of the 18th Army and Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano of the 51st Division. The Japanese did not sail blindly. They understood that Allied aircraft threatened the route. Fighter protection was planned, and the destroyers carried anti-aircraft weapons. Their commanders accepted that losses were possible, even severe. What they could not know, with precision, was how thoroughly Allied intelligence had exposed the movement, or how the new low-level attack methods would perform when used together in strength. Allied code breakers and intelligence officers had warned that a large convoy was preparing to move from Rabaul toward Leh. Reconnaissance aircraft searched the sea lanes. General Kenny and his staff were able to concentrate aircraft instead of waiting to react after the ships reached their destination. That advantage was decisive. Courage in the cockpit mattered, but courage without information might have found an empty ocean. Intelligence did more than provide a date and an arrow on a chart. Reports had to be interpreted, compared, and passed to commanders quickly enough to matter. Japanese radio traffic could suggest an operation without revealing every detail. Reconnaissance crews then had to search enormous stretches of ocean, often through cloud, while the convoy changed course beneath them. A single missed sighting could delay the attack until the transports reached fighter cover near Leh or began unloading. The Allied command structure in the Southwest Pacific was complicated, and cooperation was not automatic. American and Australian officers brought different aircraft, procedures, experiences, and service traditions to the same planning rooms. Group Captain William Gehring helped shape the coordinated plan so that the various formations would not simply arrive as separate raids. The aim was to compress the attacks, forcing the convoy to respond to bombers above, strafers at mast height, and fighters in the surrounding sky. Timing was as important as firepower. If the Beaufighters arrived too early, the Japanese crews could recover before the B-25s came in. If the medium bombers arrived too late, the convoy might remain in a tight defensive formation. If fighter protection failed, Japanese aircraft could concentrate on the low attackers when they were most exposed. Every part of the plan relied on people who could not see the whole battle once it began. That was the difference between preparation and certainty. We possessed good intelligence and a carefully arranged attack, but no officer could guarantee the weather, the enemy reaction, or the accuracy of the first bombs. Planning reduced uncertainty. It never removed it. The convoy departed Rabaul at the end of February. Weather initially helped conceal it. Clouds over the sea could hide ships as effectively as darkness, and the Japanese hoped to use poor conditions to reduce the danger from Allied aircraft. But on March 2, reconnaissance located the convoy north of New Guinea. B-17 flying fortresses attacked that day. The results proved why no honest account should say that high-altitude bombing was useless. One transport, Kyokusei Maru, was sunk. Destroyers rescued many of the troops from the water, and 2 of those destroyers made a fast run toward Leh to put survivors ashore before returning to the convoy. Other attacks damaged or disrupted the formation. Yet most of the ships continued. By then, everyone understood that the main battle would come the next morning. We were briefed before dawn on March 3. There was no theatrical silence, no speech that I can remember word for word. Men checked maps, headings, altitudes, ammunition, and fuel. Some smoked, some joked badly, some became very quiet. The officers explained the attack sequence. Medium-altitude bombers would come in. Australian Beaufighters would strike at mast height. B-25s would attack from different levels, including the modified strafers. Fighters would protect us against Japanese aircraft. The plan depended on coordination. High and medium attacks would occupy the enemy, damage ships, and break the formation. The Beaufighters would sweep the decks with cannon and machine gun fire. Then the low B-25s would close in, firing forward guns and releasing bombs at short range. If the timing failed, each group could be isolated and punished. If it worked, the convoy would face threats from several heights and directions almost at once. We took off into the morning heat. From the air, New Guinea looked endless: mountains, jungle, cloud, and sea. The formation gathered near the coast. Reports placed the convoy in the Huon Gulf, moving toward Leh. Japanese fighters were expected, and Allied P-38 Lightnings were in the air to meet them. When we found the ships, they were not arranged like targets on a range. They were moving, turning, throwing wakes across the water. Destroyers shifted position around the transports. Anti-aircraft fire began to rise. Japanese fighters and Allied fighters fought above and around the formation. The battle had depth. What happened at sea level could not be separated from what happened thousands of feet overhead. B-17s and other B-25s attacked from medium altitude. Bombs fell among the ships, forcing evasive maneuvers and adding confusion. Then 13 Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, came in at mast height. The Beaufighter was a frightening machine to see from the wrong end. It carried 4 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns. The Australians drove straight into the convoy and fired along the decks and superstructures. Some Japanese crews apparently mistook the low approach for a torpedo attack and turned their ships bow on to reduce the target they presented. That reaction may have made sense against torpedoes. Against heavy strafing, it exposed the length of the deck to fire as the Beaufighters passed over. I remember their attack as a series of flashes and lines across the water. The fighters seemed too low to remain airborne. Their fire struck bridges, gun positions, and exposed crews. Ships began to turn away from one danger and toward another. Formation order disappeared. Smoke rose. The sea filled with wakes crossing at sharp angles. Then the B-25 strafers went in. At low altitude, there is no distant battlefield. The target does not remain a shape on the horizon. It grows until it occupies everything in front of you. You see the bow cutting through the water. You see the bridge windows. You see men moving around guns. You see muzzle flashes before you hear anything, because your own engines and weapons have already filled the cockpit with noise. The pilot controlled the forward guns. When he pressed the firing switch, 8.50 physio-caliber weapons answered together. The aircraft shuddered. Tracer fire reached toward the ship, but most rounds could not be seen. They struck in a stream, tearing through the exposed upper works. The aim was to keep the gunners down during the seconds required to release the bombs. Those final seconds were not a calm, straight line from courage to victory. Aircraft maneuvered between ships, adjusted their approach, and selected targets in confusion. But once a pilot committed to the firing and bombing run, he had to hold the nose steady long enough to make the weapons effective. Turn away too early, and the bombs would miss. Wait too long, and the ship would rise in front of you like a wall. The bombs were released close to the water. Some skipped, some struck directly, some missed. Those that hit could tear open a hull, start fires, destroy machinery, or detonate inside the vessel after the delayed fuse ran out. Behind us, the convoy disappeared under smoke, spray, and flame. The main coordinated strike lasted only minutes, roughly a quarter of an hour in its most concentrated phase. In that short period, the Allied aircraft crippled the heart of the convoy. But it would be false to say that every ship sank or every man died in those 15 minutes. The battle had begun the day before. Attacks continued through March 3 and into the following days. Damaged ships were finished, survivors were rescued, and other survivors were attacked on the water. Destruction unfolded over time, even if the decisive blow came with shocking speed. Rear Admiral Kimura's flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, was hit and sank. Kimura was wounded but survived. The destroyers Arashio, Asashio, and Tokitsu Kishikaze were also lost. All 8 transports and cargoiks were destroyed. None completed the mission as planned. The surviving destroyers recovered as many men as they could and withdrew toward Rabaul. There was no single moment when we understood the scale. Each crew knew only its own target, and whether the aircraft beside it was still flying. Allied losses were small compared with the Japanese disaster, but not to the men who knew the dead. 13 Allied airmen were killed, and several aircraft were lost in combat or accidents. When we landed, the ground crews counted damage before they counted victories. They looked at wings, engines, control surfaces, and fuel leaks. Men climbed out slowly. Adrenaline left the body, and exhaustion took its place. We tried to describe what we had seen, but every account was incomplete. One man had seen a transport explode. Another had crossed over a destroyer so low he believed he could have touched its mast. Another had watched a friendly aircraft fall toward the sea. Debriefing stripped the battle into details. Officers wanted headings, bomb release distances, observed hits, enemy fighter numbers, anti-aircraft positions, damaged aircraft, and the last known location of missing crews. Memory was already unreliable. A man who had crossed the target in seconds might honestly believe he had seen 2 ships burning when smoke had made one vessel appear as several. Gun camera film, photographs, reconnaissance reports, and later intelligence were needed to correct what adrenaline had distorted. The ground crews listened while working. They did not need a formal announcement to know the mission had been severe. Holes in the aluminum, torn fabric on control surfaces, stained engine cowlings, and empty ammunition boxes told their own story. Some aircraft landed with hydraulic or electrical damage. Others returned almost untouched, which felt less like proof of safety than evidence of chance. There was relief, certainly. The convoy had been stopped, and men who had expected to lose friends found more aircraft returning than they had feared. But celebration at a combat field was usually brief. Missing crews had to be listed. Wounded men went to medical tents. Aircraft needed repairs before the next order arrived. The enemy still held Lae, Salamaua, Rabaul, and much of the region around us. That evening, rumors moved faster than facts. Men said every transport was gone, then argued over how many destroyers had sunk. Some claimed the Japanese force had been surprised completely. Others insisted fighter opposition had been heavier than reported. Only later did the larger, less dramatic truth emerge from the confusion. The attack had succeeded because many separate efforts had arrived together at the proper place and time. The official picture came later. The Japanese convoy had been destroyed as an effective fighting movement. Estimates of Japanese deaths vary by source, generally ranging from about 2,900 to more than 3,600 soldiers and sailors. Roughly 3,800 or more were rescued and returned toward Rabaul, while about 1,000, perhaps somewhat more, eventually reached Lae. The exact numbers remain uncertain, because records, rescue reports, and later estimates do not agree completely. Numbers alone cannot tell what followed. On March 4 and afterward, Allied aircraft and motor torpedo boats attacked barges, rafts, lifeboats, and men in the water. The purpose was to prevent Japanese soldiers from reaching shore and joining the fighting in New Guinea. That was the military reasoning. It does not make the site easier to remember. War in the Southwest Pacific had become bitter long before the Bismarck Sea. Both sides believed that men who escaped today would fight again tomorrow. Japanese forces had committed brutal acts against prisoners and civilians. Allied crews knew those stories, and some had lost friends. Yet history must state plainly what happened. Shipwrecked men were fired upon. Many had no meaningful ability to defend themselves. The action remains one of the darkest parts of the battle. I will not pretend that everyone felt the same about it. Some believed it was necessary. Some were angry enough to feel no hesitation. Some obeyed and carried the memory in silence. Some later defended the decision by pointing to the campaign ashore and the danger that thousands of survivors might reach Lae. All of those reactions existed. None changes the fact that the sea held men who had just watched their ships sink, and aircraft returned to attack them. The dead were not an abstract division on a map. They were sailors, soldiers, engineers, medical personnel, and laborers. Many were young. Some had already fought through earlier campaigns. Most had little control over the decision that placed them aboard those transports. Their commanders had been ordered to reinforce Leh, and the convoy had sailed because Japan's position in New Guinea depended on supplies moving by sea. The victory changed that calculation. After the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese did not again attempt a comparable large transport convoy directly to Leh. They relied more heavily on destroyer runs, submarines, barges, small coastal craft, and movement by night. These methods could still deliver men and supplies, but not with the capacity and efficiency of a convoy of transports. The Japanese army in New Guinea was not cut off in a single morning, yet its supply problem became worse, and Allied air power made large daylight movements increasingly dangerous. That is the real strategic meaning of the battle. It did not end the Pacific War. It did not destroy the Japanese Navy. It did not make every sea lane safe for the Allies. What it did was demonstrate that land-based aircraft, guided by intelligence and used in coordinated low-level attacks, could destroy a strongly escorted reinforcement convoy. It showed that air superiority could reach beyond the battlefield and attack the movement that kept an army alive. The victory also changed the B-25. Guns' field modifications proved effective enough to influence later production and conversion programs. Later, Mitchell variants carried heavy forward armament, and some configurations mounted as many as 18 Maschinen in total, with a smaller number able to fire directly forward. The exact arrangement varied by model and mission. The lesson was not that one aircraft had become invincible. It was that a medium bomber could be adapted into a powerful, low-level attack aircraft when doctrine, engineering, training, and operational need came together. Pappy Gunn deserved credit, but he did not work alone. Jack Fox, the mechanics at Eagle Farm, the ground crews in New Guinea, General Kenny, the squadron commanders, the pilots, armorers, intelligence officers, and Australian planners all contributed. Group Captain William Gehring of the Royal Australian Air Force played an important role in planning the coordinated attack. The Beaufighter crews cleared decks and disrupted defenses. The medium bombers scattered ships. The P-38 pilots fought Japanese fighters. Reconnaissance crews found and tracked the convoy. A victory described as sudden had been built by months of work. For Gunn, the outcome must have carried a personal meaning. Though we should be careful not to invent thoughts he never recorded. His wife and children were still prisoners in Manila when the convoy went down. He could not know whether they would survive the occupation. He continued serving and continued improving aircraft. In February 1945, American forces liberated the civilian internees at Santo Tomas. Polly and the 4 Gunn children survived and were reunited with him after more than 3 years of separation. Ed Lana did not live to see the end of the war. He survived the Bismarck Sea, but on April 30th, 1943, less than 2 months later, he died in an aircraft accident while performing low-level flying. He was 25 years old. Major John Jock Hennebrey later commanded the 90th Squadron and became closely associated with the B-25 Strafer campaign. The war continued, as wars do, replacing men faster than grief could be properly expressed. When people ask what I remember most, they expect the firepower. 8 machine guns firing together, bombs skipping over the sea, warships turning under attack. I remember those things. What remains strongest is the beauty of the morning and what we did beneath it. The sea was blue, the sky was clear. The mountains of New Guinea stood in the distance. From high enough, the wakes of the ships looked white and orderly. Then the formations closed, and the whole scene broke apart into smoke, spray, tracer fire, explosions, and men trying to live. We had expected serious losses. Low-level attack gave the enemy every opportunity to fire at us. The modified B-25s made survival more likely by suppressing the gun positions, but they did not remove the danger. No weapon does that. The men who flew those approaches were not fearless. Fear was present in every cockpit. Courage was holding the aircraft on course, while fear told you to climb, turn, or close your eyes. I have heard the battle reduced to a sentence. In 15 minutes, air power destroyed a Japanese convoy. There is truth in that sentence, but not enough truth. The decisive strike lasted about 15 minutes. The battle lasted several days. One transport had been sunk before the main attack. Other ships were destroyed later. Thousands died over hours and days, not in one single burst of violence. Survivors were rescued, returned to Rabaul, reached Lae, drowned, or were killed during the attacks that followed. History becomes dangerous when it is made too clean. If we turn gun into a lone inventor acting without orders, we erase the commanders and mechanics who made his work possible. If we say the Japanese never expected an attack, we erase the fighter cover, escorts, and risk they knowingly accepted. If we say every bomb hit, we erase the uncertainty of combat. If we say the entire convoy died in 15 minutes, we turn real human suffering into a slogan. The honest story is stronger. A former naval aviator and gifted mechanic helped transform a medium bomber because conventional methods were not enough. A commander recognized the idea and gave it support. Australian and American airmen trained for a coordinated attack. Intelligence found the convoy. High bombers struck first. Fighters contested the sky. Bowfighters swept the decks. Modified B-25s came in at mast height, firing forward guns to suppress the defenses before dropping bombs at close range. The Japanese expected danger, but they did not expect the full effectiveness of that combination. Their convoy was not destroyed by magic, and it was not destroyed by one man's revenge. It was destroyed by preparation, intelligence, engineering, cooperation, and the willingness of air crews to fly directly into concentrated fire. The result was devastating. 8 transports and 4 destroyers were lost. The effort to reinforce Lae failed. Thousands of Japanese servicemen died. Allied losses were comparatively light. Japan was forced to reconsider how it moved troops and supplies through waters dominated by Allied aircraft. But victory did not make the men who fought it feel powerful forever. Afterward, we still climbed into aircraft that could fail. We still watched weather close over mountain ranges. We still waited for friends who did not return. We still read letters from home and wondered whether we would live long enough to answer them. Papai Gun eventually saw his family again. Many others did not. The Japanese soldiers who died in the Bismarck Sea left families who received little more than official notice, if they received even that. The Allied airmen lost in the operation became names on casualty lists and empty places in their squadrons. That is why I do not remember the Bismarck Sea as a simple tale of triumph. I remember it as the day the rules of the campaign changed. Large ships could no longer assume that speed, escorts, and anti-aircraft guns would protect them inside the reach of coordinated land-based air power. A bomber could be rebuilt into a strafer. A bomb could be delivered from the height of a ship's mast. Intelligence could turn an ocean into a trap. And I remember the price of learning that lesson. On March 3, 1943, the main Allied attack struck the convoy in the Huon Gulf. For roughly 15 minutes, aircraft came from different heights and directions with a violence the Japanese formation could not absorb. By the time the battle ended, the reinforcement mission had failed completely. The sea carried wreckage for miles. We flew home over the same water we had crossed that morning. The engines sounded no different. The instruments sat where they had always sat. Yet none of us was the same man who had taken off before dawn. Behind us, ships were burning. Ahead of us, the war was waiting.